Ever wondered what a medieval noblewoman did if she wasn't thrilled about marrying some dude her dad picked out? Or if she just wanted, to read a book or run something bigger than a household? Turns out, the convent was a surprisingly popular choice, and not always for the reasons you might think. Some nuns held more power than married duchesses, commanding vast lands and advising kings. Imagine a world where becoming a bride of Christ could mean more freedom and influence than becoming a queen. Let's dive into the top 10 reasons why some medieval noblewomen said thanks, but no thanks, to a husband and yes, please, to the veil. Number 10. Finding your tribe, sisterhood, and community. Life in a medieval castle, especially after marriage, could be surprisingly isolating for a noblewoman. Sure, there were servants and attendants, but genuine companionship with equals, women who understood your specific world, could be rare. Marriage often meant being shipped off to your husband's estate, far from your own family and friends, to live among strangers and be primarily valued for your ability to produce heirs. For some women, the prospect of a life centered around a single man, whose moods and demands would dictate her existence, was less than appealing. Convent offered a radically different social structure, a built-in community of women. Think about it. Instead of one primary relationship, you had dozens, sometimes hundreds, of sisters. These weren't just random women. They were often from similar social backgrounds, sharing a common purpose and lifestyle. Daily life in a convent was communal. They prayed together, ate together in the refectory, worked together in the gardens, scriptorium or infirmary, and shared dormitories, at least in the earlier medieval period. This constant interaction forged strong bonds. Rules like the Rule of St. Benedict, followed by many convents, emphasized communal living, mutual obedience, and support. The abbess was the head, a spiritual mother, but the sisters were family. This sense of belonging could be incredibly powerful. For a young woman leaving her birth family, the convent provided an alternative kinship network. For a woman who perhaps didn't fit the conventional mold of wife and mother, or who simply craved deeper intellectual or spiritual connections with other women, the convent was an environment where such relationships could flourish. Consider the shared experiences, the rigorous schedule of prayers that structured their days and nights, the intellectual discussions, the creation of beautiful art, music, and manuscripts, the nursing of the sick, or the management of the convent's practical affairs. These were all collective endeavors. Letters and biographical accounts from the period, though sometimes hagiographic, often hint at these deep friendships. Clare of Assisi, a noblewoman who founded the Order of Poor Ladies, drew many women to her side, inspired by her devotion and the community she fostered. They shared extreme poverty and a deep spiritual life. While her case is one of intense religious asceticism, the element of female solidarity and shared purpose resonated in many less austere communities as well. Even in convents that were less about extreme piety and more about providing a respectable life for unmarried noblewomen, the day-to-day reality was one of shared female space and experience. This was a world largely run by women, for women. Imagine the relief of not having to constantly navigate male authority in every sphere of your personal life. Within the cloister walls, women's voices, skills, and relationships were central. This wasn't just an escape from something. It was an entry into a supportive and structured female world, a true sisterhood. Number 9. Political power plays. The strategic nun. Sometimes, a noblewoman's journey to the convent had less to do with her personal desires and more to do with cold, hard family strategy. In the intricate chess game of medieval politics, where marriages, sealed alliances, and children were valuable assets, placing a daughter in a convent could be a shrewd political move for her family. It sounds counterintuitive. Wouldn't marrying her off to a powerful ally be more beneficial? Not always. Consider the issue of land and inheritance. Noble families were obsessed with consolidating and expanding their power, which was often tied directly to the amount of land they controlled. Marrying off a daughter required a dowry, often a substantial chunk of land or wealth that would then pass to another family. If a family had many daughters providing dowries, for all of them could seriously dilute their own holdings. Placing a daughter in a convent, especially a prestigious one that the family might patronize or even have founded, was often less costly. The dowry paid to the convent was usually smaller, and sometimes the family gained spiritual prestige and influence in return, which had its own political value. Furthermore, a daughter in a convent couldn't be used by rivals. An unmarried noblewoman outside a convent was a potential pawn. She could be abducted and forcibly married to create an unwelcome alliance or a claim on her family's lands. Once she took the veil, she was, in theory, off the political marriage market. This could be a way to neutralize a daughter who might otherwise complicate succession plans or inheritance. For instance, if a king had daughters from a first marriage and then a son from a second, placing the older daughters in convents could simplify the son's path to the throne by removing potential alternative claims that could arise through their future husbands. Royal and imperial families were masters of this strategy. The Ottonian emperors in Germany from the 10th to 11th centuries relied heavily on placing their female relatives as abbesses of powerful imperial convents like Quedlinburg, Gandersheim, and Essen. These weren't just quiet places of prayer. They were wealthy, influential institutions that controlled vast territories, minted coins, and held significant legal and political rights. An abbess from the royal family was a loyal agent in a key region, ensuring imperial control and influence. Matilda of Quedlinburg, daughter of Emperor Otto the Great, became abbess at the age of 11 and ruled for 33 years, acting as a regent for her young nephew Otto III and playing a significant role in imperial politics. She was, in effect, a princess abbess, a ruler in her own right, serving her dynasty's interests. This practice wasn't limited to emperors. Anglo-Saxon England saw numerous royal women become powerful abbesses, their convents often serving as centers of family power and mausoleums for their dynasties. Saint Etheldreda, an East Anglian princess, founded the monastery at Ely in the 7th century after 2 unconsummated marriages, turning it into a major religious and political center. Her choice was certainly depicted as one of piety, but its political dimensions establishing a powerful dynastic foundation were also clear. So, while a young woman might not have personally chosen this path, her family saw it as a way to secure their legacy, manage their resources, and wield influence through the ostensibly spiritual realm of the church. Convent, in these cases, became an extension of the family's power, and the nun, a strategic piece on the political board. Number 8. Second act. A dignified life for widows. What happened to a medieval noblewoman when her husband died? Her life could change dramatically, and not always for the better. If she was young and childless, her natal family or her late husband's family might pressure her to remarry quickly to secure alliances or property. If she had young children, she might become a pawn in power struggles over their guardianship and inheritance. Even if she was older and her children were grown, she might find herself in a precarious position dependent on the goodwill of her sons or other male relatives. For many noble widows, the convent offered a respectable and often appealing alternative to these uncertainties, a dignified second act in their lives. Entering a convent after widowhood allowed a woman to retain a degree of autonomy and status that might otherwise be lost. Instead of being remarried to someone not of her choosing, or fading into obscurity within a male-headed household, she could transition into a respected role within a female community. Many convents welcomed wealthy widows whose donations could significantly benefit the institution. In return, the widow received a secure home, spiritual solace, and a community. Some widows didn't become full nuns but lived as Corodians or lay sisters, enjoying the protection and amenities of the convent without taking full vows, sometimes even retaining control over their own property. Consider Empress Adelaide of Italy, wife of Otto the Great. After Otto's death in 973, she faced political difficulties with her son Otto II and later her grandson Otto III. While she remained influential, she also spent significant time in convents she had founded or patronized, such as Cell's Abbey. These religious houses provided her with a power base, a refuge, and a sphere of activity where she could continue to exert influence through patronage and religious devotion. Her eventual retirement to Cell's allowed her to live out her final years with dignity and purpose, focusing on charitable works and prayer. Another example is Judith of Bavaria, who, after the death of her husband Henry I of Bavaria in 955, did not remarry, but instead devoted herself to raising her son Henry the Wrangler, and later retired to the Niedermunster convent in Regensburg. This allowed her to maintain influence and provided a respectable end to her public life. For widows who were genuinely devout, the convent was a natural choice, allowing them to dedicate their remaining years to God. But even for those whose motivations were more mixed, it offered security, purpose, and a community where they were valued. They could engage in prayer, charitable work, and perhaps even intellectual pursuits, free from the demands of marriage and child-rearing, and without the risk of being marginalized in their old age. Convent provided a structured environment where a widow's experience and often her wealth were appreciated, ensuring her a continued role and respect in society. It was a way to manage the often difficult transition of widowhood in a world that offered few independent paths for women. Number 7. A safe haven in a brutal world. Sanctuary and security. The medieval period, for all its romanticized images of knights and chivalry, was often a violent and dangerous time, especially for women. Wars between kingdoms, feuds between noble families, and general lawlessness could make life precarious. Castles, while fortified, were also targets. Women, particularly those of noble birth, could become spoils of war, victims of abduction or pawns in brutal power struggles. In such a volatile environment, the convent often stood out as an island of relative peace and security, a sanctuary from the storm. The very walls of the cloister offered physical protection. Convents, like monasteries, were considered sacred spaces, and attacking them was a serious offense both legally and morally. While not inviolable, history records instances of convents being raided, especially during large-scale invasions or periods of extreme chaos, like the Viking raids or the 100 Years' War. They were generally safer than secular dwellings. The church wielded considerable power, and harming its institutions or personnel could bring down severe penalties, including excommunication, which was a terrifying prospect for most medieval Christians. For a noble family facing internal conflict or external threats, sending daughters to a convent could be a way to protect them from harm. If a father was killed in battle, or a family was on the losing side of a political dispute, their womenfolk could be extremely vulnerable. A convent provided a refuge where they could be sheltered from retribution or exploitation. Christina of Markiate, an English noblewoman of the 12th century, famously sought refuge from a forced marriage and family persecution by hiding with various anchoresses and eventually establishing her own monastic community. While her primary struggle was against an unwanted marriage, the element of seeking physical safety from angry relatives and a determined suitor was a key part of her story. She literally had to hide to survive. During times of war, communities would sometimes send their women and children to nearby monasteries or convents for protection. Presence of consecrated virgins and holy women was thought to offer a spiritual shield as well. Consider the story of Saint Genevieve of Paris in the 5th century. As Attila, the Hun, and his armies approach Paris, Genevieve is credited with persuading the men of Paris not to abandon the city, and with leading the women in prayer for its safety. Legend, says Attila, bypassed Paris. While this is an early example, the idea of holy women interceding for protection persisted. Beyond large-scale conflicts, even everyday life could hold dangers. A woman traveling alone or unprotected was at risk. Within the convent, however, she was part of a large structured community with its own rules and protections. The abbess, often a powerful figure herself, was responsible for the safety and well-being of her nuns. This sense of security was a powerful draw. For a young girl, the convent could represent safety from the uncertainties of the outside world. For a woman fleeing a violent husband or a dangerous political situation, it could be a literal lifesaver. While not a perfect shield, the convent offered a degree of peace and security that was hard to find elsewhere in a world frequently characterized by its brutality. It was a haven where women could live, work, and pray without the constant fear of violence that often pervaded secular life. Number 6. No dowry, no problem. When marriage wasn't an option, or a good one. Marriage in the medieval period, especially for the nobility, was as much an economic and political contract as it was a personal union. A key component of this contract was the dowry, the wealth in the form of land, money, goods, or a combination thereof that a bride brought to her husband's family. A substantial dowry could elevate a family's status, forge powerful alliances, and secure the bride's position within her new family. But what if a noble family couldn't afford a suitable dowry for all its daughters? Or what if a daughter, for various reasons, was considered unmarriageable in the competitive aristocratic marriage market? The convent presented a practical and often quite respectable solution. Providing multiple large dowries could severely strain a noble family's resources, potentially fragmenting their estates and diminishing their power over generations. If a lord had, say, 5 daughters, finding 5 wealthy and politically advantageous husbands, each requiring a significant dowry, was a tall order. It was common practice for families to concentrate their resources on providing a good dowry for 1 or 2 daughters who could make the most advantageous matches, while other daughters might be guided towards the church. The dowry required to enter a convent, often called an entry gift or benefaction, was typically much smaller than a marriage dowry. This allowed the family to provide for their daughter's future without crippling their finances. The family would make a donation of land, money, or goods to the convent, which would then support the daughter for the rest of her life. This wasn't always seen as a lesser option. For a daughter who might otherwise face a marriage to a man of lower status due to a small dowry, or perhaps no marriage at all, which could lead to a dependent and marginalized existence in a relative's household, the convent offered a life of dignity, security, and even potential influence if she rose within the monastic hierarchy. Some families also saw spiritual benefits in dedicating a daughter to God, believing it would bring blessings and divine favor upon them. The act of oblation, where very young children were offered to monasteries or convents by their parents, was common, particularly in the earlier Middle Ages. These children, known as oblates, were raised within the monastic community and expected to take vows when they came of age. While the child had little say for the family, it was a way to fulfill a religious vow, secure a place for a child, and often curry favor with a powerful religious institution. There are also cases where a woman might be physically disabled, chronically ill, or otherwise deemed unsuitable for marriage by the harsh standards of the time, where a wife's primary value was often seen in her ability to bear healthy children and manage a household. Convent could offer a supportive environment where her worth was not solely judged on these criteria. Here, her intellect, piety, or skills in tasks like needlework or manuscript illumination could be valued. For example, Saint Leoba, an Anglo-Saxon nun who joined Saint Boniface's mission in Germany in the 8th century, was highly educated and became a respected abbess, scholar, and advisor, despite accounts suggesting she was not physically robust. So, the economic realities of the dowry system, coupled with a family's desire to maintain its status and provide for all its members, made the convent a viable and often necessary choice. It wasn't always about a lack of options, but sometimes about making the best available option in a complex web of social and financial pressures. For the surplus daughter, or the one for whom a grand marriage was not feasible, the convent offered a path that was not only economically sensible for her family, but could also provide her with a secure and meaningful life. Number 5. Childbirth was seriously scary. A safer bet for survival. Today, we often take the relative safety of childbirth for granted, thanks to modern medicine. But in the medieval period, pregnancy and childbirth were profoundly dangerous undertakings for women, regardless of their social standing. For a noblewoman, whose primary societal role was often defined by her ability to produce heirs for her husband's lineage, repeated pregnancies were the norm. And with each pregnancy came a significant risk of death or permanent disability. Choosing the convent, a life of celibacy, meant entirely sidestepping this life-threatening reality. Maternal mortality rates in the Middle Ages were staggeringly high, though precise statistics are difficult to ascertain. Estimates suggest that anywhere from 10 to 20% of women, and perhaps even higher in some periods or regions, died as a result of pregnancy or childbirth. Complications that are treatable today, such as hemorrhage, infection, puerperal fever, eclampsia, or obstructed labor, were often fatal. Cesarean sections were rarely performed on living women, and when attempted, almost invariably resulted in the mother's death. Medical knowledge was limited, hygiene standards were poor by modern comparison, and skilled obstetric care was virtually non-existent. Midwives assisted at births, relying on traditional practices, but they were helpless in the face of severe complications. Think about what this meant for a young noblewoman. She would have grown up seeing female relatives and friends die in childbirth or suffer debilitating injuries. It was a common and accepted tragedy, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. Pressure to produce a male heir was immense, often leading to a relentless cycle of pregnancies. If a wife failed to produce children, or only daughters, her position could be precarious. She might be repudiated, or her husband might take a mistress. The very act of fulfilling this duty put her life on the line, again and again. Some noblewomen endured 10 or more pregnancies. Blanche of Castile, mother of King Louis X of France, had 12 children, though not all survived. While she lived to a relatively old age, many were not so fortunate. For a woman contemplating her future, the prospect of a life free from this particular fear could be immensely attractive. In a convent, her body was not dedicated to procreation, but to God. The physical demands of monastic life, fasting, vigils, manual labor, could be arduous, but they did not carry the acute, recurrent risk of death that came with childbirth. Nuns, if they survived the common diseases of the era, could live to a ripe old age. Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, for example, lived to be 81, an unusually long life for the 12th century, during which she was incredibly productive. Had she been married, her life might have been cut short by her 5th or 6th pregnancy. While piety, intellectual ambition, or a desire for autonomy were powerful motivators for entering a convent, the sheer relief of avoiding the dangers of the marital bed and the birthing room should not be underestimated. It's a stark reminder of how different women's lives and choices were when their physical survival was so intimately tied to their reproductive role. For some, the choice wasn't just about spiritual salvation. It was about a much better chance at physical salvation here on earth. Convent, in this light, was not just a spiritual haven, but a haven from a very specific gendered form of mortality. Number 4. Dodging a horrible hubby. Escaping unwanted marriages. Happily ever after was more fairy tale than reality for many medieval noblewomen when it came to marriage. Marriages were typically arranged by families, often when the bride and groom were still children. These unions were primarily about politics, property, and power, not romantic love or personal compatibility. A young noblewoman might find herself betrothed to a man decades older, someone known for cruelty, or simply someone she found utterly repulsive. In a society where a daughter's obedience was expected and her options were limited, what could she do if she desperately wanted to avoid such a fate? Convent offered one of the few available escape hatches. The pressure on noble daughters to marry according to their family's wishes was immense. Refusal could bring disgrace upon the family, disrupt carefully planned alliances, and result in severe punishment or coercion for the disobedient girl. Yet, some women resisted, and the Church, at least in theory, upheld the principle that marriage required the consent of both parties. If a woman could demonstrate that she was being forced into a marriage against her will, or that she had a true religious vocation, she might find support from ecclesiastical authorities to enter a convent instead. This was often a difficult and protracted battle. One of the most famous examples is Christina of Margate, an Anglo-Saxon noblewoman born around 1096. Her parents arranged a marriage for her, but Christina felt a strong calling to a religious life and had privately taken a vow of virginity. She fiercely resisted the marriage, enduring years of pressure, threats, and even physical abuse from her family and her determined suitor. She was eventually forced into a marriage ceremony, but refused to consummate it. Her struggle was epic. She sought help from various religious figures, lived in hiding, and faced immense opposition. Ultimately, after many trials, she succeeded in having her marriage annulled and was able to pursue her religious vocation, becoming a respected hermitess and later the prioress of a community of nuns. Her story, while exceptional in its drama, highlights the extreme lengths to which a woman might have to go to avoid an unwanted marriage, and the convent as the ultimate goal of her resistance. While not all cases were as dramatic as Christina's, the fear of a bad marriage was a valid concern. A husband held enormous power over his wife. He controlled her property and her person. If he was cruel, abusive, or unfaithful, she had little recourse. Divorce as we know it didn't exist. Annulments were possible, but difficult and expensive to obtain, usually only granted on grounds like consanguinity, being too closely related, or non-consummation. For a young woman facing a future with a man she feared or detested, the regulated, communal, and female-led environment of a convent could seem like a paradise in comparison. Even if the life was strict, it was predictable and free from the whims of a single, potentially tyrannical man. Furthermore, some women might have simply found the idea of marriage and wifely duties unappealing. They might not have wanted to subordinate their lives to a husband and the demands of running a household and raising children. Convent offered an alternative life path where their energies could be directed elsewhere, towards God, learning, or administration within the community. So while families often initiated a daughter's entry into a convent for their own strategic reasons, some women actively sought it as a refuge from the often harsh realities of aristocratic marriage. It was a way to exercise a small measure of control over their own destiny in a world that offered them few choices. Number 3. Boss, Lady Abbis, power, influence, and land management. Forget the stereotype of the meek, cloistered nun entirely cut off from the world. For some medieval noblewomen, Becoming an abbess was a path to wielding significant power, authority, and autonomy, often far more than they could ever hope to achieve, as a wife, even a queen. Prestigious convents, especially those with royal or imperial patronage, were not just spiritual centers. They were major landowners, economic powerhouses, and influential political players. And at the head of it all was the abbess. An abbess was essentially the chief executive officer and spiritual leader of her monastic community. She was responsible for the spiritual well-being of her nuns, but also for the often vast temporal affairs of the convent. This could include managing extensive agricultural estates, collecting rents and tithes, overseeing trade and craft production, running courts of justice for the convent's tenants, and even in some cases, minting coins or raising troops for defense. The abbess of a wealthy convent was a feudal lord in her own right, sometimes with vassals and knights who owed her service. She would negotiate with bishops, princes, and kings, defending her convent's rights and properties. Consider the princess abbesses of the great imperial abbeys in the Holy Roman Empire, such as Quedlinburg, Gandersheim, and Essen. These women were often members of the imperial family or high nobility. As abbesses, they ruled over territories that were virtually independent states. They had a seat and a vote in the imperial diet, meaning they participated in the governance of the empire. Abbess Matilda of Quedlinburg, 955–999, daughter of Emperor Otto the Great, not only managed her vast abbey but also acted as regent for her nephew, Emperor Otto III, during his minority, effectively governing a significant part of the empire. She commissioned historical works and was a major patron of the arts. This was power on a grand scale. Even beyond these imperial examples, many abbesses held considerable sway. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098–1179, abbess, mystic, composer, writer, and medical practitioner, founded 2 monasteries. She corresponded with popes, emperors, kings, and leading intellectual figures of her day, offering advice, criticism, and prophecies. Her influence was immense, and she achieved it not as a queen or a nobleman's wife, but as an abbess. She traveled on preaching tours, a highly unusual activity for a woman of her time, addressing both clergy and laity. Within the convent itself, the abbess's authority was nearly absolute, though she was expected to rule with wisdom and consultation according to the monastic rule. She made decisions about the admission of new nuns, the allocation of tasks, the enforcement of discipline, and the direction of the convent's resources. For a woman with leadership, skills, administrative talents, and intellectual capabilities, the role of abbess offered an unparalleled opportunity for self-realization and the exercise of authority. While marriage might place a noblewoman in a grand household, she was almost always subordinate to her husband. As an abbess, she was the one in charge, responsible for a complex organization and many lives. This path allowed certain women to become true boss ladies of the medieval world, shaping not only their own communities but also influencing the wider social, economic, and political landscape. The power they wielded was real, tangible, and often endured for their entire lifetime. Number 2. The only school in town: access to education and arts. In an age when education for women was rare and often rudimentary, convents stood out as vital centers of learning, literacy, and artistic creation for noblewomen. If a medieval girl had an intellectual spark, a love for books, or a talent for music or art, the chances of nurturing those gifts in a secular married life were slim. Most noblewomen were taught basic household management, perhaps some music and needlework, and enough literacy to read a prayer book. Serious, scholarly pursuits were generally considered the domain of men, specifically clergymen. Convent, however, offered a different path. Many nunneries, especially the larger and more well-endowed ones, maintained schools for their novices and sometimes for young girls from noble families who were not destined to become nuns but were sent for a period of education. Here, women could learn to read and write, not just in the vernacular but often in Latin, the language of scholarship, liturgy, and international communication. This literacy opened up a world of knowledge. Convent libraries, though varying in size, often contained not only religious texts like the Bible Psalters and Lives of Saints, but also classical literature, historical chronicles, and scientific treatises. Nuns didn't just read these books. They copied them in the scriptorium, painstakingly transcribing manuscripts by hand, often embellishing them with beautiful illuminations. This work of copying was crucial for the preservation and transmission of knowledge throughout the Middle Ages. Beyond literacy, convents were places where women could engage in serious intellectual work. Hatzwitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness at the Gandersheim Abbey in Saxony, is a stunning example. She was a poet and a playwright, the first known female playwright in the Western world since antiquity. She wrote 6 plays in Latin, modeled on Terence, but with Christian themes, celebrating the virtue of virginity and the strength of female saints. She also wrote historical poems and legends. Her work demonstrates a high level of classical education and literary skill, all fostered within the environment of her convent. Then there is Herad of Landsberg, abbess of Mont Saint-Odile in Alsace. In the late 12th century, she compiled the Hortus Deliciarum, Garden of Delights, an encyclopedic work intended for the education of the nuns in her community. It covered theology, philosophy, history, astronomy, geography, and botany, and was lavishly illustrated with hundreds of miniatures. Though the original manuscript was tragically destroyed in 1870, copies of portions of it and descriptions survive, testifying to the breadth of learning available to and produced by women in some convents. And of course, Hildegard of Bingen, mentioned earlier for her power as an abbess, was also a prolific writer on theology, natural history, and medicine. She composed an extensive body of liturgical music, including hymns and sequences, and even invented her own language, the lingua ignota. Her intellectual output was extraordinary by any standard, male or female, of her time. Such achievements would have been virtually impossible for a noblewoman outside the cloister. The arts also flourished. Nuns were often skilled in needlework, creating elaborate vestments and tapestries. They sang the daily divine office, and in some convents, polyphonic music was composed and performed. The creation of illuminated manuscripts was itself a major art form. For a woman with artistic or intellectual inclinations, the convent wasn't a place of deprivation, but a place of opportunity, a space where she could learn, create, and contribute to the cultural and intellectual life of her time in ways that were largely denied to her secular sisters. It was, for many, the only school in town that would take her seriously. Number 1. Religious calling and true devotion. While social, political, and personal safety factors certainly played significant roles in many noblewomen's decisions to enter convents, we absolutely cannot overlook what was, for a great number of them, the primary and most profound motivation. In the deeply religious society of medieval Europe, faith was not a peripheral aspect of life. It was central, shaping worldviews, daily routines, and ultimate aspirations. For many women, the desire to dedicate their lives entirely to God, to pursue spiritual perfection, and to secure eternal salvation was an all-consuming passion. The medieval Christian faith presented a powerful vision of life's purpose. The earthly world was seen as a temporary and often sinful place, a prelude to an eternal afterlife in heaven or hell. A life of dedicated prayer, Contemplation and service to God within a monastic setting was considered one of the surest paths to salvation, a foretaste of paradise. For women who felt this spiritual pull, the call to become a bride of Christ was not a metaphor for settling for second best, but the highest and most noble vocation they could aspire to. This involved a commitment to the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience, lived out within a supportive community focused on spiritual growth. Mysticism was a powerful current in medieval spirituality, and many women were drawn to it. Figures like Mechthild of Magdeburg, 13th century, a beguine who later entered a convent, wrote The Flowing Light of the Godhead, detailing her intense mystical experiences and visions of God. Bridget of Sweden, 14th century, a noblewoman, widow, and mother of 8, founded the Brigittine order after receiving a series of divine revelations. She traveled to Rome, advised popes, and became a prominent spiritual figure. Her devotion was unwavering, and her life demonstrates how personal religious experience could lead to extraordinary actions in the founding of new religious communities. These women, and many like them, were not seeking escape or power in the worldly sense, but a deeper union with the divine. The lives of saints provided powerful role models. Stories of early Christian virgins who had chosen martyrdom over marriage, or noblewomen who had renounced wealth and status for a life of prayer and service, were widely circulated and deeply inspiring. Saint Radegund, 6th century, a Thuringian princess forced to marry the Frankish king Clotaire I, eventually left her abusive husband and founded a monastery at Poitiers, becoming a deaconess and dedicating her life to prayer, asceticism, and caring for the sick. She became a celebrated saint, and her example resonated for centuries. For these devout women, the daily rhythm of the convent, the liturgy of the hours sung throughout the day and night, private prayer, spiritual reading, confession, and communion was not a burden but a joyous framework for a life centered on God. The renunciation of worldly possessions and marriage was not seen as a loss, but as a liberation from distractions that hindered spiritual progress. They genuinely believed that by forsaking the world, they were gaining something infinitely more valuable, a closer relationship with their Creator, and the promise of eternal life. This profound spiritual conviction, this deep-seated love for God and desire for holiness, was undoubtedly the driving force for a significant number of medieval noblewomen who chose the veil. It was a choice made not out of necessity or convenience, but out of the depths of their faith and a yearning for the sacred.